Today, we're going to break down a really big Supreme Court of Canada decision, R v. Lee. And this is a case that really pits two fundamental ideas of justice against each other. You've got individual rights on one side and public safety on the other.
So, where does this whole story begin? Well, it all starts in a pretty specific and you might think an ordinary place, a private backyard in Toronto.
And in that yard, you have 5 young men. They're just hanging out, talking, and then police walk into the yard, unannounced, no warrant. And this gets us to the absolute core question of this entire case. At that exact moment, do you feel free to just turn around and leave?
All right, let's really get into it. We're going to start with exactly what happened that day, the specific events that kicked off this huge legal debate that went all the way to the top.
So you've got 3 police officers who walk into this private backyard. They start questioning the men, asking for ID, carding them. One of the guys, Tom Lee, starts to look pretty nervous. He's kind of trying to hide the satchel he has. An officer spots this and asks him, "Hey, what's in the bag?" And that's when Mr. Lee just takes off running. After a short chase, they catch him, arrest him, and when they search him, they find a loaded handgun, some cocaine, and a good amount of cash.
Now, on the surface, this might seem pretty straightforward, right? Police found evidence of some really serious crimes. But it's the how they found it, that forced the Supreme Court to grapple with some incredibly tough questions. Like, where do you draw the line between a legitimate investigation and an illegal intrusion?
Okay, so the court really had to wrestle with 3 main things here. First, was Mr. Lee arbitrarily detained, basically held without a good reason, the second those cops walked in? That's a right we all have under Section 9 of the Charter. Second question, as a guest in that backyard, did he have a right to privacy? That's Section 8. And then the million-dollar question, if his rights were violated, does all that evidence, we're talking the gun, the drugs, the whole thing, get tossed out of court?
So how the court's majority answered that first question, the one about detention, is absolutely crucial. And to get to their answer, they had to do something pretty radical. They had to redefine a fundamental legal idea.
Just a quick refresher. Section 9 of our Charter is what protects every Canadian from being detained or imprisoned arbitrarily. It's basically a shield that protects our personal freedom from the government just stepping in without a solid, legal reason.
But what does detention actually mean? It's not always about being in handcuffs, right? It can be psychological. The legal test really boils down to this. Would a reasonable person put in that exact same situation feel like they had any real choice but to do what the police were telling them?
And folks, this right here, this is the absolute game changer in this case. The court basically said, hold on, this reasonable person can't just be some generic, neutral idea. From now on, the law has to look at the world through the eyes of the person who was actually there. That means you have to consider their race, their age, and the real-world social context, like the well-documented history of racialized communities being policed differently.
And you've got to listen to the language the court itself used. The majority was incredibly direct. They said that for these young men, this wasn't just some random encounter with police. No, it was, and I'm quoting here, a common and shared experience of being targeted. And that experience would, without a doubt, change whether they felt they could just walk away.
So, using this new, more realistic idea of a reasonable person, the court's majority came to a clear conclusion. Mr. Lee was psychologically detained the very second those 3 police officers walked into that backyard. And because they didn't have a warrant or any legal reason to be there, that detention wasn't just a detention, it was an arbitrary one.
Okay, so that finding that there was an arbitrary detention has huge consequences. It leads directly to the final verdict. But this is where things get really intense, because the court was deeply divided on this. We're talking a sharp, powerful disagreement right at the highest level of our justice system.
And the final ruling? All of that evidence was thrown out. The gun, the drugs, the cash, all of it. It couldn't be used in court. Why? Because when the charter is breached, there have to be real consequences.
So how did they decide to throw it all out? It comes down to a 3-part legal test. And what's fascinating is how the majority and the dissenting judges looked at the exact same situation and saw 2 completely different things. On police conduct, the majority called it serious misconduct. The dissent, they saw it as more of an inadvertent error. The impact on Mr. Lee's rights, the majority said it was significant. The dissent argued it was less significant when you weigh it against the crimes. And finally, society's interest in a trial. Both sides agreed that's important, but the majority concluded that upholding the Constitution, our highest law, was even more important.
For the majority, this really came down to a fundamental principle. They basically said that for our justice system to mean anything, the rules have to be the same for everybody, in every single neighborhood. It's all about maintaining the public's trust in the rule of law.
But the judges who dissented saw it in a completely different light. Their view was stark. They said that the decision to exclude this evidence, especially a loaded gun, was, and I'm quoting them now, not merely alarming, but intolerable.
So what was their main argument? It was all about public safety. In their view, the immediate danger of a loaded firearm being out on the street was a much, much greater harm to society than the police misconduct that led to finding it.
So why does this one case matter so much? What's the big takeaway? Well, this decision wasn't just about Tom Lee or what happened in that backyard. It sent massive ripples through the entire Canadian legal system. It actually changed how our law is supposed to see the world.
Let's look at the lasting legacy here. First, R.V. Lee redefined that reasonable person test to include social context and race. It forces courts to acknowledge the real, lived experiences of racialized communities with the police. It also confirmed that courts can and should look at social science research on things like racial profiling. And maybe most importantly, it changes the legal rulebook for how police can interact with people, especially young people in marginalized communities.
And in the end, this case leaves us with this huge, difficult question. It's a question that every free and democratic society has to wrestle with. When you have this clash between personal rights and public safety, where do we, as a society, draw the line?